Square off with yourself, motherfucker. What's up, everybody? Going down this weekend, July 6th, will be Nate Diaz versus Jorge Masvidal 2. And yes, this time it is in the boxing ring. And I know a lot of people out there have kind of had some mixed feelings about this. You know, there's some people out there that are like, man, I can't wait to see Diaz versus Masvidal again. And then you got that other crowd that's like, who cares? Two old men, they're washed, all these different things. And I got to be honest, guys, like, I'm kind of excited for this. And not only am I just, I'm a really big fan of Nate Diaz and his brother Nick. And Jorge Masvidal is another guy I've been watching for an extended period of time. But this has turned out to be actually kind of a solid card for a promotion that's not under DAZN or not under Top Rank in terms of boxing. This is a pretty well built out card. And I know that there's some guys on there that a lot of people aren't going to be familiar with, but we got Danny Jacobs on there, Shane Mosley's son, like we got Ryan Garcia's brother. Like there's some solid boxing matches on this card, some guys that are going to have an opportunity to shine. And that's one of the things I love about Nate Diaz, right? He's doing something that a lot of guys have never done, right? They use their star power and their fame to go out and do other things and put their other guys on. You know what I'm saying? And that's what Nate Diaz is doing. It's what I love about Nate and respect the hell out of him for. A lot of these guys that are on the card are from Team Diaz. And the co-main event is a really solid matchup between Anthony Showtime Pettis. I mean, we all know Anthony Pettis as MMA fans, man. And then you got Chris Avila from Team NDA, Nate Diaz's team, who I've always been on the record saying out of all the MMA guys from NDA that have transitioned over to boxing, I think Chris Avila is the best one out of all of them in terms of the boxing department. I think he has got solid power, good cardio, good volume, and he's out there taking on some tough challenges, man. His most recent boxing bout, I think he's won 5 or 6 in a row, was just out there against brutal Jake Boswick, who's been in BKFC, who's just an absolute monster. So he's a guy that's willing to take on challenges, and I like this matchup as the co-main event. Now, let's hop into this matchup. What are we looking at here? Well, what we saw back, everyone wants to talk about UFC 244 and what we saw when Jorge Masvidal and Nate Diaz fought at Madison Square Garden for the very first BMF title fight in UFC history. And everyone keeps bringing up that fight, right? And I understand bringing up that fight, right? It's when these guys were in there the last time against each other. However, this is so different now, man. This is so different. You're talking about two guys are two of the most famous MMA fighters to ever compete inside of MMA period, but specifically the UFC. They go out, they're now kind of doing their own things. Masvidal's still under contract for the UFC. However, they're giving him, the opportunity to take on some boxing matches that they basically approve, is what kind of Masvidal was alluding to. But this is a completely different style of matchup compared to when it is in the UFC, right? Now, we're not just talking about, because this is boxing and MMA, but the style as a fighter that both of these guys are, right? Jorge Masvidal, everyone has this narrative that I don't want to say is a false narrative, but I just think is a little bit blown out of proportion. And that's that Jorge is some world-class boxer, which is just not the case, guys. But Jorge Masvidal, throughout his career, or in the early days, he relied on a lot of head movement, and he did have some very good boxing, and he still has very good hands. But Jorge, he's more of a Muay Thai guy, right? If you watch a lot of his fights, especially when he had this, total blow up inside the UFC back in 2019, becoming Fighter of the Year, all those different things, when he basically took the sport by storm, it was the knees, it was the elbows, it was the nasty kicks. Like Jorge Masvidal has outstanding Muay Thai technique. He even has a very good teeth that he likes to utilize. And while he is a very explosive fighter on the feet, in my opinion, I don't think he's as good of a boxer as everybody says that he is. Now, in a matchup with Nate Diaz, Nate is a guy that he's been doing it for a very long time. He's been in boxing gyms. He's trained with Andre Ward. We've all heard about that. And he's training with Richard Perez, who I think is an outstanding boxing trainer. He's been with him for many, many years. And the Diaz brothers get the sport of boxing. They've been training it, ever since they were little kids, and they have very, very good straight punches. Nate also is really, really good at dirty boxing, right? We've seen that in the UFC. We saw that against Jake Paul. He does a good job of just kind of tying you up and letting some of those short shots go inside. So that's another thing to watch out for in this matchup. The issue that I've always had with Nate is he does not move very well. And a lot of what we saw back when he was at 155, when he took on Michael Johnson, that was like a vintage boxing Nate Diaz. That was what, if that guy showed up against Jake Paul, I could have seen him possibly winning against Jake. Now, that is a matchup I do want to bring into play here, because a lot of people are going to say, oh, well, Jorge Masvidal, he had a boxing match back in the day, bare knuckle, and all these different things. Nate Diaz's most recent boxing match, which was his last fight, was against Jake Paul. The styles of Nate Diaz and Jorge Masvidal are very different. While Masvidal is pretty tough himself, that is always what Nate Diaz seems to have the advantage in, as well as he does have good straight punches. And that 1-2 is an offbeat 1-2 that just seems to find a way to land on guys and catch them. Now, people are going to bring up the Jake Paul matchup, right? And I just think Nate Diaz is a tougher fight for Jake Paul than Jorge, because with Nate, he kind of has the hands up, walks forward, kind of like a zombie, dipping and ducking, and kind of just making it a very awkward, weird, not exactly your most traditional style of boxing match, where Jake Paul was quite a bit bigger than Nate Diaz. We got to see that on fight night. Jake Paul looked like he was in a different weight class, at least in my eyes. And Nate wasn't just going to sit on the outside and try to play a points type of game and play that kind of game, knowing that if he did that, there was a real shot that he could have gotten knocked out by Jake Paul, given how much bigger and stronger and more explosive Jake Paul is, which is why I say Nate is a harder matchup, because if Masvidal was in there with Jake Paul, trying to play the outside move, stick and move type of game, I could see Jake Paul catching him, in all honesty. Not to say Masvidal couldn't go out there and catch him, but I just think that would have played a lot more into the style favor of Jake Paul. But what we're going to see July 6th, right? Two guys that are pushing close to 40 years of age. They are not what they were back when they fought at UFC 244. But what we have seen is Jorge Masvidal, towards the later part of his MMA career, you kind of saw the fame maybe start to play a little bit of a factor. How seriously was he taking these matchups? Now, I do want to point out, he was fighting some of the best guys in the world, right? As was Nate Diaz before he left the UFC. It's not his fault. Khamzat Chimaev missed weight. Tony Ferguson had to step in. We know Ferguson was a little bit on the decline there, but we saw what Nate did to Leon Edwards. We saw Masvidal have moments against Kamaru Usman, against Colby Covington, goes out there, he's beating up the legs of Gilbert Burns. However, at the end of the day, getting outstruck by Gilbert Burns, getting taken down by Gilbert Burns, there's no takedowns in this. This is strictly boxing. And if I have to go with somebody who's going to be busy with the hands, right, we got to look at what boxing is, right? It's not going to be, everyone says, oh, it'll just be a dirty, grimy type of fight. That doesn't really exist in boxing. You don't really allow that to happen. I got to lean towards Nate Diaz to get this done. I think Nate Diaz wins this by decision. This is going to be at 175 pounds. This is going to be 10 rounds. And what we've seen from Jorge Masvidal throughout his career, he tends to gas. And I know a lot of people are going to say, well, oh, but the wrestling, there's no wrestling here, Jake. And yes, that is very true that there's no wrestling. However, Nate's pace and pressure and the way that he boxed against Jake Paul, if we see that Nate Diaz, even though it wasn't, the most technically crisp Nate Diaz by any means, and it wasn't exactly what I was expecting from Nate Diaz inside the boxing ring, I think that guy beats Jorge Masvidal. I think Masvidal gets very, very tired. I think he fatigues. I think Nate's activity is going to be the difference in this matchup. And I also don't think Nate is going to be worried about the power like he was with Jake Paul. Guys, Jake Paul is a big dude, and I understand Jake Paul isn't this world-class boxer. However, he's been doing it for a long time. He's got good power, and he's been training with some top guys, man. Like Jake Paul does have some decent boxing skill. And while I think Jorge Masvidal does have good speed, while I think he has good timing, while I do think he has pretty good boxing himself, I just don't think he's going to be able to get Nate out of there. He may take the first couple rounds, and then Nate is just going to slowly but surely start to pour it on him, get in his face, pepper him continuously, just keep throwing punches and bunches, and that will be the difference in this matchup. I'm going Nate Diaz by decision. I think that he gets the job done, but nonetheless, I think it's going to be entertaining. I think these guys get the game, man. They understand business. The way they promote, the way they entertain is by them being basically like two badasses, right? That's just what they've been known for throughout their career. I think they're going to put on, I think it's going to be a fun show, but I want to hear from you all down in the comments. Like this video, comment your prediction below. Are you Team Diaz? Are you Team Masvidal? Subscribe to the channel, help your boy out. I would appreciate it. See you next time.